So our MCs tonight are Picchuan Feng and Jen Liu, both of whom are Margins Fellows with AAWW. Picchuan Feng is a writer and artist born in Hong Kong, raised in Vancouver, and currently living in New York City. Her writing has appeared in The Margins, Rice Paper Magazine, and Omega. She is also the founder of Elastic Magazine. Jen Liu is a nonfiction writer and a graduate of the MFA program in memoir at Hunter College. She's the recipient of fellowships and residencies from Kundiman, Jerome Foundation, and Anderson Center at Tower View, among others. And now I'm going to hand it off to our MCs. Yay!
All right, thank you guys all for coming out tonight. I'm Jen Liu.
I'm Picchuan Feng.
Tonight's event is called Mother, and it's the culminating event of the Women Writers at W.O.W. series. Their very first reading was called Favorite Daughters, so we thought that this would be a kind of nice, match to that. We have an amazing lineup of readers for everyone tonight. We have Sahar Muradi, Kira Madden, and Tina Chang, who will all be reading and discussing topics of mothers and motherhood in all its forms and variations. So we'll be each one of us will be introducing one of the readers. They'll come up to read, and then there's going to be a short Q&A afterwards with audience participation invited.
Yeah, we just also want to take a moment to thank Emma, Yuki, Alicia, and May here at Womxn Writers. As well as Jyoti and Yasmin at Asian American Writers Workshop for this opportunity. And we hope you enjoy the evening.
All right, so our first reader tonight is Sahar Muradi. Sahar is a writer, performer, and educator based in New York City. She's the author of the chapbook Gates from Black Lawrence Press and the co-author of A Ritual and X Movements. She's the co-editor of One Story, 30 Stories, an anthology of contemporary Afghan American literature, and the co-founder of the Afghan American Artists and Writers Association. She is the recipient of the 2016 Stacey Doris Memorial Prize and two-time recipient of the Himan Brown Creative Writing Award in Poetry. She is a Kundiman Poetry Fellow, which is how I know her, and an AAWW Open City Fellow. Sahar works in the poetry and education programs at City Lore. So join me in thanking Sahar.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much. Thanks to the workshop, to Jen and Picchuan, and to the WOW project, and to Womxn Writers for hosting. And this is such a beautiful collaboration. I feel truly honored to be part of it. I was reading about the history of the store, and I myself also grew up in a family business, I was telling May, so it kind of hits home. And it also hits home because my mom is in the audience. So the topic of motherhood is always on my mind now. So just thank you, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to read 3 short pieces. The first is from a chapbook or chaplet with Belladonna, the feminist press, and it's called A Garden Beyond My Hand, and I was pregnant last year, and I have a 9-month-old now. So the chaplet is really focused on being sort of grappling with mental health issues while being pregnant, living in the world, being, sort of watching what's happening locally and globally, and knowing that you're bringing a person into this world when things feel like on fire all the time. So I just want to read their journal entries, so I'll start with that. And you might remember this day. June 19th. The child crying for her mother, her father, the children. The agent says we have, quote, an orchestra, but we're missing the conductor. Only we know the conductor, the orchestrator. To peel her off, to unbind, to forcibly detach. Do not pick her up, instructs the agent. No touch. To break touch breaks down. to touch this one forming still through her canopy, and to hear the wail of that one robbed of her mother's touch. To at once know that I bring forth into the architect's den, and to bring forth still. To bend the word threat as an open jaw, whose fangs elude the one family and swallow the other. To sense this one kick freely in the pool to govern the direction of that one's legs. To hear the cry yet not collapse, to fortify one's ideology. I touch this roof and think the difference between it and roofless is chance, a hair, this delicate skin between us. I have not been writing as much as I hope to be writing. So this is like the one poem I've written since Soma's birth. That's not true, but maybe one semi-complete poem. But, also just thinking about sort of maybe responding to the Kavanaugh trial or the hearing, and I wish he was on trial. But sorry, the thing. So again, just sort of thinking about birthing a daughter at this moment in time. The great green field for Soma. Here is the great green field where at last I can remove the high heel of language. Let the body supple in its meaning, her mouth my guide. It's the mouth I live for, that lives for me. Her wail that shatters wild, small heart beasting out of cage, my animal wonder every day. And if she purpled awake, not from my legs, but from the medicated sheet of men, and if my mouth sealed with each breaking, each violent crashing of the news, and if the year was marked by the believers and the disbelievers, and if I believe, will no one believe in the name of God he thrust into me? And if in her buto tender hands I hang, shame on language that meets me, pulverizes me in public, revels in the republic for whom I was not natural, so naturalized me, makes of her miracle a mockery, life before life, after which islands better eaten by the sea. Say, I see you, dare, daughter, hear you against all belief, brave this thin earth devolving in the jaws, dream you perfectly personed, embodied, least secret to yourself, the most sacred, you scare them all free. I'm gonna get some water, sorry. Okay, so I'd heard from a former mentor teacher that when she had her child, she's a writer, and when she had her child, it was really difficult to find time to write, but what worked for her was writing 3 words a day, which she eventually turned into a book of poems. It's quite beautiful. It's Lisa Jarno. So I sort of took that as inspiration, and I, of course, was like super ambitious and said, I'm going to do 3 lines a day. And my child is nursing quite a lot in the evenings and early mornings. So like in the bleary-eyed 3 a.m. when I'm nursing her, I'm not religiously, not nightly, but when so moved, I write a few lines. And these are not edited, so I'm not sure if they make any sense, but the one thing that I take away from it is I'm in love with this child. I am in love with her, and there's something really almost erotic about this meeting in the middle of the night, like 2 bodies, 2 needs, 2 lovers, really. So I'm kind of calling it tryst for now. Okay. So there are 3 lines. I'll just pause between. Asleep at the wheel, how to usher home, tiger on a tightrope. My balloons pound, bombs past 3, a beggar for her cry. The night you showed up early, howling, whose panic chafed back, and history in its new outfit. Rubber band arms and other pithy epithets, I eat them all. You push and pull at once, learn your lesson early, the heartbreak of desire. Your arrows rise and fall in ecstasy, pleasures twinned, like licking Lethe. The lesson of no dependence, but your own body's hard desire. You cross the river in tears. Nothing stops our trysts. My body at war still waits for your knock, my general. I go to you, fire in my throat, but my virus does not go, halo upon your mouth. The whiplash of your wheeze cracks my midnight face, wakes open my every wrong. No shame in demanding, yanking, squeezing. Your urgency will soon disappear. You'll forget how badly you wanted to live. You are clocking in again, almost on the hour, each time my white flag bruised. We have to break it off. Habit has corrupted need. Rescue, devoured, response. My air has gone out of me, muscles dragging to your cage, my hair fanning limp in the sea. Are we complicit in the quiet outside this prayer? We are not each other's alone. We are not alone. We leave the room to lengthen your appetite, hear the cutlery of your cries. We gnaw on our hesitation. I think that refers to sleep training, but I'm not sure. Okay. My wrists weep, gray gloves to lift you, no one to lift me. The night before work, before 2, I am thinned beyond 1. I want to lead for a change. My wants multiply or simply resurface, months fattening quietly, a new diamond in the room. I marvel at your starfish growing, the pinch, the press. I know nothing. This is getting rude, the hourly doorbell. My love can't buy time. It's Ramadan and I fast from the illusion of control. My prayers double, demands for an unbroken field. My birthday comes and goes. I should be different already. I wonder, can you taste my wars? The good daughter, bad daughter schism. My own mother resurrects often. I get caught and leap past you, me, any measure of wise. Turn it over, a friend advises. But the soil has no more sides. What will you eat if I can't hold it down? Now I drag the office to our moment, or the paper legs of my self-esteem. Please, God, keep you in the dream. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Sahar. That was beautiful. I'm delighted to introduce Kira Madden. Kira Madden is a lesbian APIA writer, photographer, and amateur magician living in New York City. She is the author of the memoir Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, which was published this March by Bloomsbury. She holds an MFA in creative writing from Sarah Lawrence College and a BA in design and literature from Parsons School of Design and Eugene Lang College. She is the founding editor-in-chief of No Tokens, a magazine of literature and art, and is a 2017 NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellow in Nonfiction Literature. She has received fellowships from the McDowell Colony, Hedgebrook, Tin House, and Yaddo, where she was selected for the 2017 Linda Collins Endowed Residency Award. She facilitates writing workshops for homeless and formerly incarcerated individuals and currently teaches at Sarah Lawrence College. Please welcome Kira Madden.
Thank you so much. Thank you, each and every one of you, helping organize tonight. This space is so beautiful. I'm so honored to be in the presence of these readers. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It means so much. And for those who don't know, this is not a microphone, so it's recording us, but I don't want anyone feeling frustrated like we're not using it. We're not supposed to. I am going to read from my newish book, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls. It's a memoir, it came out this spring. And my mom is also here in the audience. So it's a night of moms, and this book is largely about her and how much I love her. So I'm going to read a piece called Bugs. Bugs. I discovered them in a Cracker Barrel bathroom. The bugs, that is. Ruthie Mitchell's mom took us to a Cracker Barrel off the Sawgrass Expressway for a real-life experience, for a change of scenery, and we like this. The triangle peg game, the slopping grits, the rocking chairs, Dolly Parton singing through a tinny speaker. We could be other people in this place, adults on a highway in the cool breeze of night, taking shifts to drive 1,000,000 miles north to find Jesus, or husbands, or any other world outside our middle school. But in the bathroom light, in the mirror, I see it. Something moving on my head, just a fleck, really, no fatter than a poppy seed. I lean in closer to the mirror. Dolly is singing about her coat of many colors, and I move both palms to either side of the part in my hair. I push down with my hands to flatten the hair like a sponge, and I see them, bugs, skittering away from the light, away from my part, running down to my ears. Sorry if you start itching. I itch every time I read this. I don't mention my bugs to Ruthie Mitchell or her mother for the rest of dinner. I don't want to ruin our adventure. I don't want to be a bad guest. Instead, I eat my chicken fried steak, and I nod to everything they both say, and I am quiet, very quiet, in the car ride home to Ruthie Mitchell's house situated right on a cemetery. I wait until we turn on Airplane, until the two Girl Scouts beat each other to heaven, swinging each other by the pigtails, and then I say, "Your house, Ruthie, do you think it's haunted seeing that people are buried in your yard?" "Maybe," she says. "I mean, probably." "I think my head is haunted by some critters," I say. Mrs. Mitchell calls my mother immediately. She checks Ruthie in the guest bathroom, their bodies bent over the sink. Bugs, she says, bugs everywhere. "Who has more bugs?" I ask. "Why should it matter? You've both got them." "I think Ruthie must have given them to me," I say, "because I don't live dirty like that." Really, I'd had a feeling about the bugs for months. I'd never seen them, but one day in art class, Gleb and Kari screamed, "Lice," pointing right at my head. I scratched at the scabs already hardening on my scalp and started crying. Lucky for me, I could tell our art teacher already hated Gleb, who always drew cartoon tits and ass. It's art, and gave him a Saturday detention for harassing me, the shy girl with a chronic itching problem. "We'll call you Alligator Girl," my father once nicknamed me, like a superhero name or a freak show star. I got the head-to-toe eczema from him. When my mother arrives at the Mitchell's house, Ruthie warms a baby bottle in her microwave. She curls up in a beanbag chair in the living room, sucking milk from her bottle. She's worked up, Ruthie Mitchell, my 13-year-old friend. She barely wants to say hello. "Ruthie's got bugs too," I say, and she's pretty upset. Mrs. Mitchell tells my mother I've got a pretty bad case, the worst she's ever seen. "You didn't notice until now?" "I don't live up my daughter's ass," my mother says in the car. "How would I notice?" My mother shakes her head. Has she noticed that her daughter sucks on a goddamn bottle? Day one, my mother brings home a Publix bag of stinky chemicals from the drugstore. She sits on a lawn chair in our backyard and has me sit on a towel between her legs. She uses a knit pick to ease out the bugs and eggs, the worst occasion for Chinese hair, she says. We should be done with you by Christmas. She soaks the comb in a bowl of rubbing alcohol. She kisses me on the shoulder. I've got you, she says. If I see one more, I'll nuke 'em. Day 2, she buys a box of neon shower caps. Wear these around the house, she says, and when you sleep. I can't stop crying when I see myself looking like a Mario Kart mushroom in the mirror. I feel like a dumb kid, like someone filthy. Your dad and I will wear them too, she says, so you won't be the only one looking like a stupid shit. She snaps a yellow cap on her head. The elastic digs a red line into her forehead, and I feel like I have never loved anyone more. Day 3, my mother tries to suffocate the bugs with mayonnaise. She spoons it out with her hands, piles it onto my head. She twists the black and white mound until it looks like ice cream and snaps a new cap over it. I gag into the kitchen sink, dry heaving dramatically. So there's a nymph, a nit, and a louse, she says on day 4. We need to kill everyone. She's been reading about it, highlighting pages she's printed from the library. She tells me to sit in our bathtub, and I wear a ruffled bathing suit that fits too tight. She pours vinegar, vegetable oil, apple cider, then Listerine. My eyes prickle. She smothers my head in Vaseline before snapping on a new cap. Day 5, we scald them. I sit in the bathtub again, knees to my chest, my bathing suit warm just out of the dryer. My mother's cap is green today. She holds the shower head right to my scalp, turns the knob, bite me if you have to. Day 6, a straightening iron to every separated strip of hair. We listen to the bugs sizzle pop inside the clamp. Each morning, my mother takes me back into the yard. I sit on my towel, I yank off my cap. She combs through every section of hair, picking at movement. She tells me, for the first time, stories about growing up in Hawaii, the old banyan trees in her backyard, the feeling of the pali winds on her shoulders, the places where she still misses her father, her ohana, makuakane, here and here and here, she says, touching every corner of her body. Honey girl, there are so many people I have never quit missing. Each night, my mother boils the combs and tools in pots of water. She tumbles my clothes and blankets on high. She places my stuffed animals in the freezer. She drops my jewelry into tiny plastic bags, seals them tight. She stays at my bedside, kissing every knuckle of my hands until I fall asleep. They chose you because you're the sweetest, she says. When I wake in the middle of the night, it's not because my mother and father are throwing ashtrays and glasses at each other. There are no crashing sounds, no cries, no smells of burning plastic or voices belonging to people who are neither my mother nor my father. Instead, for this week, I wake to the hum of my mother's vacuum. She is covering every inch of the house, checking, cleaning, protecting every pillow, as if by this simple act of cleaning, she's making the promise of a new life for me, a life in which 2 parents take care of a child, a life as simple as that. By the following week, the bugs are gone. My mother checks the tender spots behind my ears, the warm places behind my neck. Nothing, she says. All good to go. Are you sure? I ask. I still itch. You're good, she says. Nothing. She tears off her cap, kisses me on the forehead. I'm sure you're thrilled to go back to school. She winks. Later that night, in the bathroom mirror, I move my palms back to my part. I press down on the hair again. I wait. This time I don't see anything. I don't see anything moving at all. My hair is just my hair. My scabs have peeled. There is nothing alive on any inch of my head. No nymphs, no nits, no lice. But they were right here, I say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's so beautiful to see all the mothers here, I have to say. All right, so our final reader tonight is Tina Chang. Tina Chang is the Poet Laureate of Brooklyn. Yes. And she's the first woman to be named to this position and was raised in New York City. She's the author of the poetry collection Hybrida, now out from W.W. Norton. as well as the collections Half-Lit Houses and Of Gods and Strangers. She is co-editor of the anthology Language for a New Century, contemporary poetry from the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. Her poems have appeared in American Poet, McSweeney's, Plowshares, and the New York Times, among others. She has received awards from the Academy of American Poets, the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund, the Ludwig Vogelstein Foundation, the New York Foundation for the Arts, Poets and Writers, and the Van Leer Foundation. She currently teaches poetry at Sarah Lawrence College.
Thank you. I know, I kind of want to use this as a microphone, right? Thank you so much. So thank you to the WOW Project and the organizers tonight, Jen and Pikshwan and Jyoti, who I feel like now we've known each other for such a long time. Way back when I was a version of the Margins Fellow, it changed over time. And the name changed over time, but it really, getting the fellowship, I think, I don't know, I can't even count, maybe over 15 years ago or something, really helped to just give me confidence as a writer. When I started out as a writer, I had never had an example for myself of an Asian American writer. So if you can imagine, I went through college and not one of my teachers ever exposed me to an Asian American writer. So I didn't really know what I was missing until I stumbled upon the Asian American Writers Workshop, and then an entire world just opened up to me. So I cannot thank the AAWW more, because I think through them it just gave me, I don't know, a life to be a writer and the permission to be a writer. So I'm so grateful. I thought I would do a combination. By the way, your story of lice, I'm very familiar with lice. I was very proud of myself as a mom because my children are ages 8 and 10. And up until this year, I was very proud that they never, and kind of snobby, that they never got lice. And then this year, they got lice 3 times. And it was so familiar because everything that you were saying, from the mayonnaise to the vinegar to just literally pouring minty mouthwash on top of their heads with a swim cap, I went through it so many times. So thank you for that reminder. So I thought I would read a little bit of prose and a little bit of poetry, do a combination of both. So I have a new book out called Highbrow, and it's talking about my son and my daughter of mixed race. And right before the book was going to come out, my publisher said, you know, you might want to write some prose because people don't read as much poetry. I'm like, thank you for having so much confidence in me. But so they thought it was a good idea if I wrote maybe a prose piece for the Times to just, I don't give this book some background. So this does give it some good sort of information for this book. So when this piece came out about a month or 2 ago, I did not tell my mother. And so my uncle, who reads everything, called up my mother and said, Tina has a piece in the New York Times. She calls me up. She says, I heard you have a piece in the New York Times. She said, why didn't you tell me? And I said, because I thought you would disapprove. And she said, well, I said, so did you read it? She said, I did. I said, how do you feel about it? She said, I really disapprove. So I said, you see, she says, I'm driving over right now so we could talk about it. So it didn't go very well, the conversation, but I mean, I think that's the thing with mothers and daughters and families, is that you eventually work through it because you only have one family. So we talked about it, and I think that this piece kind of tries to detail some of that. And if you find yourself disapproving at some point, just know my family feels the same exact way, okay? So this is called No More Hiding, My Son or My Love, which I also did not approve of this title, but the Times had named it. So no choice. So my son's name is Roman, by the way. So my son Roman turned to me from his book and said, Mom, can you throw me a blanket? This is my favorite part in the book, and I don't want to stop. When I look at my son, I see myself, the inability to tolerate pain, even from the smallest of physical hurts, the deep fear of the dark, of the deserted street, of that strange insect on the ceiling, and the intense abiding love of reading. Most of all, I see myself in his face,
the eyes like mine, left slightly larger than the right, especially when he's tired, and the toothy smile that breaks through the most serious of situations, all of it me. Yet, when he and I walk along the street, so many people feel the need to tell me how much he isn't like me, how incredibly unalike we appear, how he looks just like his father. They say it with such authority. My son is biracial. His father is Haitian American, and I am of Chinese descent. Often, I have to work to prove that my son is mine. On our daily subway commute to school, at least one person will look at me, and then at him, and then back again. I'm forced to see what they see. His skin is darker, and his hair is wavy, while I'm fair, with hair that won't hold a curl. If their eyes happen to meet mine, they'll catch me glaring, holding them accountable for what I deem to be their silent judgment. Perhaps I'm too hard on these strangers who wonder about the people before them, a mother and a child reflected in a train window, one holding the other's hand. But my own judgment has roots too. And each time I face a stranger's gaze, I'm forced to confront them anew. 10 years ago, I stood alone at a Chinese banquet after my stepfather's funeral, deciding where to sit. I was 7 months pregnant with my son and hadn't told my family, but I knew that my expanding waistline would elicit questions. After contemplating which relatives would be least likely to grill me, I wound up sitting with my mother, who offered me her silence. I was unmarried and close to giving birth, the worst outcome in Chinese tradition. I knew my mother was disappointed, but I felt elated. I had dreamed of my son for years, envisioned the joy his existence would offer. At the banquet, I ate soup without tasting it, swirling bits of scallion in the broth. My partner, Claude, was waiting at home, cleaning the apartment in preparation for the months ahead. He offered to accompany me to the funeral, but I told him I wanted to go on my own to avoid questions about us, though I didn't explain what that meant. His parents, who had emigrated from Haiti, taught him to rise above conflict with enviable grace. When I met Claude, the prospect of being in an interracial marriage with mixed-race children wasn't something that we had discussed. I lived as I wanted and dated who I wanted, and I followed my heart. I didn't, however, assume that my heart would lead me to question the depths of race and my own biases, or to ask how whiteness shaped my upbringing and how that seeped into a struggle over who I was or who I chose to start a life with. Before I left for the services, Claude asked me one last time if he should come. I sheepishly shook my head. On the way to the subway, I thought about the man we were to bury. Growing up, we called my stepfather Archie Bunker, the 1970s sitcom patriarch who spewed racist views but was, at his core, soft-hearted. Archie was a prime example of white audacity, a posture embraced by my stepfather, who emigrated from Hong Kong, knowing little English. His bigotry seemed to spring from self-doubt about his own place in a country that prided itself on diversity, even if the imbalance of nearly every power dynamic suggested otherwise. My stepfather lived by stereotypes and assumptions and made his views known about classes or races that weren't his own. At dinner, he and I would go head to head as I questioned his intolerance until my mother told him to hush. I gave in because Asian tradition to obey my elders. I gave in because it was Asian tradition to obey my elders, no matter the personal cost. At the funeral, I bowed my head, weary with the memory of him. I didn't bring my partner some odd way of honoring a man who had soiled my ideas of love. Although his racism didn't permeate my thinking, it caused me to act in a way that countered the love that I felt growing inside me. I could imagine the disapproval he would have shown for my future husband and my son simply because they are Black. Determined not to let a deceased man's ideas control my life, I decided I would gather my immediate family to be open with them about my love and my pregnancy. A week later, we all came together for a picnic, my belly heavy, my partner and family exchanging awkward greetings under blooming red maple trees. I watched as my brother threw a football to Claude, and they tossed it back and forth, not like siblings, but ones who may be one day. Each small gesture was magnified. I touched my belly, assuring my son that I would defend his presence, and I was sorry for ever having hidden him from my family. His life, then and now, prompts me to answer the question, what do you believe? Nearly 10 years later, leaning next to him so he could read his book, I realize he's large enough to hold me. Lately, his obsession with books has paved the way to writing. His favorite genre is science fiction, graphic novels that contemplate the world's end, filled with five-horned demons and dragons that drop from the sky. In one of his illustrated frames is a lone dark figure standing in a throng of white ones. Below it has written, "Who am I?" His words stopped me. Was he speaking for a fictional character in one of his apocalyptic scenarios, or for his present self? "What do you mean by this line?" I ask. He shrugged. "It's a story of a boy who goes into a room, peels off his skin, comes out into the world, and he wants you to guess who he is." I carried Roman's words with me for days, wondering if I had done enough to help him to understand his selfhood. My thoughts moved beyond my stepfather to my ancestors, who I believe took part in building a world that could have possibly rejected the person that I loved the most. I challenged many of the traditions I was born into. I reject the racism I perceived growing up, and yet within my family, aspects of love and how it is revealed and accepted have changed. As I watch Roman grow, his questions become my questions. As he claims his identity, I feel bound to claim mine as well. When his teacher scolds him too harshly, I ask myself if it's because of the color of his skin. If he is left out of a play date, I wonder if it's because he is Black. Every thought and every action I now contemplate with an interior dialogue about race. I am his mirror, he is mine. It's a human process with answers not definitive but ongoing. Each day he grows stronger, more able to face the world racing toward him. Perhaps I can say the same for myself. We grow together, loving within the struggle of our bond. In the moments before my birth, Claude sat with me, stroking my arm. He told me everything would be okay. And I fell asleep during labor, believing him. For once, I was completely relaxed. Roman would be here soon. How I waited for him. I wrestled with my ancestors to let me claim a hold of my life. As if I were a character in one of his sci-fi stories, I dove into the muck in the minutes before his birth. It seemed as if there were serpents, an ocean, and a terribly gray sky that held me underwater with its furious hand, begging them to let me return to the real world again. I fought to be with my son. I could almost see him now, all the colors of my longing inside him, the universe sweating to move him from an idea to being, the both of us born from the urgency of belief. He arrived as a boy, a very real boy, placed right there beside me, alive. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. And I just thought I'd read one poem, and that's it. Thank you so much, just ahead of time for listening. Okay, and this is called Fury. So as I was writing this book, it changed a lot. So when I first started writing it, I think it was really lame. I feel like I was writing this book that was based on fairy tales, but I didn't really know what I was saying. And just like a lot of people who give birth, I didn't really have a lot of time. I was just nursing all the time and trying to just find the minutes that I could write. So it took me actually about 10 years to write this book. But I believe if you write a word, even a word a day, if you write a word a day, you eventually get somewhere. So that's what I did. I sort of wrote a few lines here and there and eventually got to complete a book, but it did take me almost a decade to do so. So I'm just going to read this last poem for you. And this is called Fury, and it was written after the Michael Brown and Eric Garner verdicts. And if you remember, they sort of came like right after the other, and they were right on the heels of each other. My son rubs his skin and names it brown, his expression gleeful as I wipe a damp cloth over his face this morning. Last night, there were reports that panthers were charging through the streets. I watch from my seat in front of the television, a safe vista. I see the savannah. Sometimes, though, my son wakes to a kind of nightmare. He envisions words on the walls and cannot shake them. He tries to scratch them away or runs out of the room, but the words follow him. None of it makes any sense, but it's the ghost of his fear that I fear. What is a safe distance from the thoughts that pursue us? And what if the threat persists despite our howling? Buildings collapse. A woman falls down the stairs and lands on her back with only one eye open, half awake to her living damage. I think my son senses what's happening on the street, his heart fiercely tethered to mine. I know the world will find him and tell him the history of his skin. Harm will come searching for him and pour into him its scorching mercury, its nails, its bitter breath against his boyhood skin, still smelling of milk and wonder. Somewhere, the panthers are running, starting fires fueled by a distinct hunger. Somewhere, there is a larger fire, a pyre stoked by the fury of all that we've come to understand, all that we could have done but did not. Its flames lick the underside of the earth. It propagates, needing only a frenzy of air to fan it to inferno. I'll call that the forest. The deep woods are ahead, and if the panthers could just reach it. If I told you that all of this happens at night, you wouldn't believe me. If I told you that all of this happens in the future, always the future, you would continue following the scent you could only describe as smoke. I'll call that justice. But aren't we talking about mercy and its dark twin? Isn't that what's pummeling history on the side as I write this? Isn't it the thorn and the taser? Isn't it the chokehold and the gold arm of vengeance? I say it from my mouth, and when it spills forth, it lands on the ground in a pool of light reflecting back at me the one true blasphemy: love and love and love and love and love and love, and love is crowding the street and needs only air, and it lives over there in the distance, burning. Thank you so much.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay. So Jen and I just have a few questions that we prepared, and after that we'll open it up to any audience questions. So we wanted to know, who do you consider to be your literary or artistic mothers?
That's a great question. Well, today it's Maya Angelou. Still I Rise, just because of everything that's happening now. And I feel like I have so many, and I've been reflecting. I feel like I have mothers and I have fathers. I have, I feel like one of the people who gave me permission was Marilyn Chin. And the poet Marilyn Chin, I felt like I started reading her work and feeling like, wow, she's expressing everything that I hope I would like to express one day. And I don't know if I'll get there, but I felt like she kind of opened up a doorway for me. And before I had mentioned when I was in college that I wasn't really exposed to that many Asian American writers, but there was one visiting professor who came, and it's a male, and his name was Aga Shahid Ali.
and Aga Shahid Ali was from Kashmir, and he was my professor for a short period of time. He passed away over 10 years ago, but he was probably the first person that gave me an inkling that there were Asian American writers, but because before that nobody said that they existed, so I just assumed that they didn't exist. So he opened up a world to me of not only Asian American writers, but also Asian writers, writers that were writing, and also writers in translation. So yeah, I feel like that was probably two most influential people.
For me, Linda Berry. She does comics, and she wrote the incredible novel Cruddy and The Good Times Are Killing Me. And she's an illustrator and writer. She's Hapa, and her whole methodology about playfulness, of never forgetting playfulness in her work. I met her once, and she drew a small monkey for me as a reminder to not take things too seriously. And I actually got it tattooed on my arm, and the tattoo artist really messed it up. And it's just like this monkey blob, and I wanted to get it covered or removed, but then I was like, that's the point of the drawing. This all happened for a reason. So I just love everything she does. She also has a fantastic book called Syllabus, if any of you are teachers or just need some prompts with your writing. Again, always reminding you how to just bring play into the classroom and into your writing processes.
I think that the synchronicity is really wild, because earlier today I was reading Aga Shahid Ali's book of poetry. Actually, it's the one dedicated to his mother upon her passing. So I just love that you invoked him. He's someone special for me as well. And I'm not saying this because she's in the audience, but my answer would be my mother as a literary and artistic mother, because she introduced me to poetry. I was quite small when I came at the age of 3 from Afghanistan, and we came with very little, but one thing that was one of the most precious things in our home in Queens, in Elmhurst, was this book of poetry, 14th century Persian poet named Hafiz, and there's a tradition in Afghanistan and throughout Central Asia, South Asia, parts of West Asia to you read the poems, but you also use the poetry for a kind of horoscope. So from a young age, you'd be like, oh, is there something on your mind? Come over, we'll consult Hafiz. And so I would just park next to her, and I was 8 years old, and I just wanted to know, am I gonna I don't know, why doesn't so-and-so want to be my friend? Why is Nilüfer treating me so badly? And then, you just open at random the book, and then she would read the poem, and then she would interpret it for me. And I just fell in love with the language. I couldn't understand all of it. He's a very difficult poet, actually. That's why I need an intercessor to help me understand it. But I think she planted the seed of literature in me, and we still have that tradition. We still share that. And then I would just add that for me, seeing another Afghan writer, it took me until college, and I went to a small liberal arts school in Western Massachusetts. I was the only Afghan in the school, which is not uncommon at that time, but I came across a young Afghan poet here in New York, and we met under odd circumstances at a conference post invasion, U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, so there was a lot of things happening here, and she's like, you write poetry? I was like, I write poetry, you write poetry? And she was putting together this anthology, and so I sort of joined her. But it was the moment, she's a sister, I will say, she's my literary sister, but the moment was wow, someone else was writing about family identity, immigration, about these things I felt like I was doing, in a silo on a farm at the end of Massachusetts. No one was interested in what I was writing. But I found someone who I was interested in reading, so that was awesome.
Thank you so much for sharing. The next question, the poet Rachel Zucker said, "Motherhood is a hybrid form, and there aren't a lot of discussions about this." So Tina, I read in an interview you did a couple years ago that when you heard this, you felt she gave voice to something you experienced. Can you talk more about motherhood and hybridity? And Sahar and Kira, if you're also thinking about motherhood, and hybrid forms in relationship to each other.
Yeah, when I read that quote by Rachel Zucker, it was at Sarah Lawrence College, and there was a panel discussion. We have something called the Sarah Lawrence Poetry Festival every year, and she came to discuss hybridity. And I remember that they asked me to be the moderator for the event. I said no, and they said, "Why are you saying no?" And I said, "Well, I'm so interested in the content that I don't want to distract myself by being the moderator. I just really want to be an audience member, and I want to hear what they have to say about hybridity." And I think that what she meant about motherhood, and it's sort of a hybrid language, and something else that I also say in the book is that for a lot of mothers, I feel that the language that we speak among ourselves is a very specific language, the language of like staying up at night, of nursing, of lice, of all this kind of stuff that is not necessarily in literature. So thank you so much for putting that, these kinds of experiences that could very easily sort of float away. But I found that even sort of being in the playground, that as soon as I started to speak to mothers, there was this kind of language that we fell into, that we gave each other a certain sense of responsibility for that language. And when I would move out of the playground, it was sort of like I would consider myself speaking a completely different language, where I was trying very hard not to speak about motherhood at all. And in terms of hybridity, I felt like the reason why the book is called Hybrid is because being a mother, and especially being a mother of a child of mixed race, I really didn't feel that what I was writing was fitting into traditional forms. So when I was studying, when I was getting my MFA, I would learn these Western forms like sonnets and sestinas. I would learn everything and feel like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to be learning in school, in college, in graduate school. These are the forms I should be learning if I want to be a poet. And then as time went on, I realized that, especially with this book, that my ideas were not fitting into traditional spaces. So then I actually started moving into Eastern spaces. I started studying this form called the Zuhitsu, which was made very popular in the United States by Kumiko Han's book called The Narrow Road to the Interior. And it took me a really long time to understand the Zuhitsu, to even write a Zuhitsu in the book. So the Zuhitsu translates into the idea of running brush. So you run your brush across the page. And it deals a lot with fragmentation and randomness. And this idea was very odd and explosive to me. Like, how could I write in a poetic form that's just dealing with fragmentation, collaging? And I felt like all of that kind of spoke to what I wanted to do, that my ideas were not traditional. My life was not traditional. Nothing that I was doing fit into anything that I learned. So it's almost like I didn't erase my education, but I really had to shake it up a little bit. And in hybrid forms and hybridity, and thinking about, well, how am I going to create my own language with my own ideas, my own identity? I had to not discard my past, but I had to really highly question it, and then I had to just like shake it up and move through it and really begin to challenge it.
That's really beautiful. I feel like being offered the moderator position. I just want to learn from all of this and think about that. That's really beautiful.
So I'll just say, I guess for me, hybridity is about occupying multiple spaces, and I love language that sort of you can't pin, and I think that's why I am moved to write poetry, and a lot of my prose is poetic and my poetry is prosy, and I don't want to be boxed. I had something else I wanted to say and I totally forgot. Hybridity, can't remember. Sorry. yeah, maybe it'll come to me later. But yeah, I think that I'm just drawn to hybrid forms, and I think motherhood for me. Oh yeah, that's it. Motherhood is. I am occupying multiple identities at the same time. I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a writer, I'm a ... And something I found really that spoke to that is when I was pregnant and I was learning about body and changes and all of that I was undergoing. I remember reading that when we are in our mother's belly as women, our ovaries are growing and our eggs are developing in our ovaries, right? So when I was in my mother's stomach, my baby was already forming. So my baby was in my mother's stomach. It's like so trippy, right? And that for me like kind of speaks to, it's like this multiplicity. I'm so fascinated by these ways that we inhabit many spaces at once and are connected to many people, and so it's sort of like, I guess a short answer is I sort of take that idea into my writing and into my being in the world.
I had a question prepared, but after hearing everyone read, I feel like I'm gonna switch it up. Or maybe I'll ask it after this, but I mean, I love the way in which I think in all three pieces there is this sense that connection between mother and child has an almost like illicit quality to it, or a desire that's not just desire for mother and child, but almost romantic, or these kinds of boundary crossing ideas. I wonder if there are other topics around motherhood that you feel like are not discussed in the same way that particular type of intimacy is not really discussed, if that makes any sense. Are there things that you feel like, have not been talked about around ideas of motherhood that you wish were talked about, or that come to mind?
Well, I mean, I think that being a mother is, it's just a very strange place to be, because most of the time we're really isolated. And I think that I wish I saw more pieces that spoke to that kind of isolation. It's almost like really like going through war. Your body is adjusting to this completely opening up, giving birth to this child, and after this, nobody tells you that you're going to be by yourself for a really long time with this child. And so you're expected to have all of this patience and all of the life lessons and everything figured out in order to be able to present it to a child. There's this really cool book, I don't know if anybody's read it yet, it's called Good Talk by Mira Jacob. And I'm going to be doing a talk with her in the fall, but it's such a cool book, because when we're talking about hybridity too, I felt like she's writing prose, but she's also she's a memoirist, and then she's also drawing pictures, so it's a graphic memoir. And my son kind of picked it up. He was waiting for the pub date. Like he's like one of those kids that reads, like waits for a pub day, like an adult. And so we went to independent pub day, which was like a few months ago, and I said, pick any book you want. So he was wandering through the children's aisles, and then he said, oh Mom, I've been waiting for Good Talk. He's like, could I get Good Talk? So he sat in the car and he read it in one sitting, and then I posted about it online, and then my friend wrote to me, she said, are you sure he's supposed to read that book, because it's actually really inappropriate for him. She's like, there's like naked parts, there's like things about sex, and there's things about drugs. And I went to my son, I said, did you read, like, were there inappropriate parts? He's like, no, and the ones that were, because I just knew that Mom would say don't look at it, so I ignored them. I was like, sure you did, Roman. But what I love that Mira Jacob does in that book is she really talks about how, as a mom, she doesn't have it figured out. I love that she talks about that. So sometimes it's like, I don't know what it is that hasn't been written yet. I just know what it is that has been written that I connect so fully to. So in the graphic memoir, her son, who's the exact same age as my son right now, they're 10, but as she was writing it, he was 8 years old. And it was just after Trump was elected, and the son is asking so many questions. Like, it seems like Trump doesn't like people with brown skin, and I have brown skin. So does that mean that he doesn't like me and he doesn't want me in this country? So as a mother, she's really struggling to sort of make herself feel safe enough to be able to answer his questions. And I think that I love that kind of movement toward trying to address the sense of unknowing. And that, I mean, how many of us in this room really feel like we haven't figured out? I mean, I'm just like, I kind of feel like I walk around, I'm a total wreck. Now that I'm old enough, I love my mom. I feel like I'm the only person whose mom isn't here tonight. But I mean, my mom, as I'm growing up and growing older, and not saying this out of disrespect, she's also a mess. You know, we're both kind of messy in how we handle life. And by the way, I'm seeing her tomorrow morning, so it's not like I didn't want to be with her. So I'm gonna see her in like 10 hours. But I do love the space of admitting things as a mother that we don't know. And that even as we're relaying those lessons to our children, to be able to say to my children, I don't have the neat lessons of life. I only know how I got here in one piece up until this point. I can tell you sort of kind of what I did, but you know, don't take my word for it, kind of thing.
I think for me, I'm not a mother, but it was important to me in writing this book, speaking of multiplicities of truth, so that the book would be interested in contradictions and complications, and that no one felt like a flat caricature of mother or father. And it's called The Tribe of Fatherless Girls, but I think like that less and fatherless is really the important part of the title, because it can be that desire or just gap in so many relationships, whether they're mother relationships, parental relationships. And I wanted the fatherless and the motherless. I wanted mother love and mother loss and fatherless and father loss, all of those things to run side by side in tandem. And I wanted to just dig into the complications of being messy, of not knowing, of the different relationships I have with my mother versus the relationship my mother has to my stepbrothers versus the relationship my mother has to the children she had given up for adoption. Like, those relationships all look really different, and they're all really complicated, and I don't think any tethers are stronger than others, but I'm interested in those nuances and making sense of them and breaking apart the sense that I feel I have in hopes that when I'm ready to be a mother, I guess I can accept my own messiness as a control freak. I don't know if that answers your beautiful question at all, but...
No, it does.
I guess one topic I'm interested in around motherhood now is I'm also in a biracial relationship and raising a child in a home where I'm trying to speak to her in my native language with a very thick American accent, and very imperfectly. And my partner, who's South African, is speaking to her in English, but with some Afrikaans. And I feel I didn't grow up practicing Islam in a traditional way. I have, a relationship with my God, but I didn't grow up praying, for example, and I celebrated some holidays, but not, many. So my relationship to my heritage and my inherited religion and my language is already sort of diluted or is complicated, and I really wanted I want to raise my child with some of the things that I didn't grow up having necessarily, but I don't have a relationship strong enough to pass myself. So I love when my mom visits, and she's in North Carolina, but I love where I'm able to sort of tap her and have her show my daughter things that she was working too much, that I it was I think many of us might relate to having immigrant parents who are working all the time and not available in the ways that maybe we needed or we hoped. But I'm still sort of negotiating what that looks like the parts of my heritage that are important for me to pass on and to relearn myself, and the parts that perhaps don't fit anymore. And I think I would like to learn from others who are asking similar questions.
We wanted to open it up to the audience. If anybody has a question, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. I guess I'm trying to word it better, but like, what do you feel you're leaving for like your children or like the next generation with your writing, especially when it incorporates like more autobiographical aspects of yourself, especially like when as your kids grow up, like in the future, like do you consider that as you're writing about them, if they're going to be reading about it, or because like my son's 10 and like it's like they're learning how to use the internet real fast, so I factored into like some of these works like that incorporate motherhood instead of like incorporate motherhood and stuff.
So we're going to repeat the question for the recorder.
Okay.
For posterity, yeah. So I think the question, and correct me if I'm wrong, is about how our writers think about the legacy that they're leaving to their children or loved ones, especially with the fact that many of the works have autobiographical elements to them, how our writers negotiate that sort of interplay relationship.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot. My son has come to a couple of my readings, and I remember a couple of instances I had to actually explain to him what I was speaking about within the book, because it's like I'm writing about my son, but the themes are quite mature in the ways that I am describing, not necessarily what's happening to him, but the environment of the racism within the United States right now, especially now, and trying to tame my fear. I mean, I think that the book is so much about a mother's fear, and that our biggest fear is that we will lose the thing that we love the most. That is every mother's fear. No matter, even my mom is still, she said, I never stop being a mother. I never stop worrying about you. I said, oh my gosh, how could you still be worried about me? I was like, my life is half done. I said, how could you be worried? She says, until you go to your grave, or until I go to my grave, I'm always going to be worried about you. And so I haven't quite expressed to my son, even though he comes to my readings, he hasn't quite figured out what it is that I'm trying to say. Like, for example, right before I gave a reading, I was going to show it's part of like this hybrid poem where I'm influenced by social media and YouTube videos, and one of the YouTube videos is a video of a young boy who at the time was 7 years old, coming out of a car with his arms raised. He's a young black boy, and he was coming out of the car with his arms raised. And the police officers were looking for 4 men in like a Nissan, but they stopped a woman with 4 children in like a white Toyota. So before I showed that to the audience, I showed it to my son. And he was very afraid. He says, why are they holding a gun at this little boy? Can you explain it to me? And those are the hard things, I think, for a mom to explain to a child. Because first I have to go back to the roots of racism, right? And I have to explain to him, well, he stopped this car, and he thought it was supposed to be 4 men, but he goes, but that's not what happened. It's, from a child's perspective, he said, that's not what's happening though. They're not 4 men, they're actually 4 children. I said, that's the point. I said, and that's the sort of world that we're living in. And so, and then no joke, with my work, I give my son nightmares because, I mean, if I really describe to him the true reality of the world in which we are living, it is frightening to a child. So then I have to find that balance of leaving a legacy behind, and then also finding a safe psychological space for my son to live. Because in one of the last poem that I read, it had talked about he sees words on the wall and he can't shake them, so he still to this day has nightmares. So any story that I tell him, even if it's part of something to keep him safe, it makes him very afraid. So he's just a sensitive soul. So I have to balance what I want to leave and what I want to tell him now. So chances are what it is that I'm leaving for him, he'll be able to read as an adult. and maybe understand more of it. Maybe when he's an adult and I get to be an older adult, we'll have a different conversation than me having a talk with him right now when he's 10 years old.
For me, and I think probably so many of us can relate to this, my book is largely about like generations of trauma and shame. My book's about addiction and generational trauma. My mother, Chinese Hawaiian, my father, Eastern European Jew. And I read something recently that was really kind of world-changing to me, that it's so simple but so true, that said, if generational trauma exists and is true, generational healing also exists and is true. And that felt so beautiful to me, that through this book and through just bringing to light the things that were once considered shameful or secretive, I could sort of break that spell around that shame, bring it to light, bring it forward with all its nuance and contradictions, and talk about it and bring humor forth for events that were maybe really tragic, and look at the light. And I hope that through that, my children moving forward and other people in my family can see that the events depicted in the book, the addiction specifically, they're not sources of shame anymore, that they can be examined from this different lens, a lens of forgiveness and understanding and empathy, and yeah, that's my hope.
I love that you mentioned shame. I think a lot of my writing is motivated by trying to get out of that space, or to and yeah, I also have long been writing about my family and family stories, and I think, you know, there was a time where my dad would be like, why are you interested in talking about the past? Like, what are these old stories? Like, why are you always asking me these questions? But, you know, because it wasn't talked about, because there were these mysteries, and there were, I mean, I was so hungry to know, like, why, you know, like, how did you grow up? Why did we come here? What, you know, and it felt critical to be sort of like the archivist of the family. Like, somebody had to preserve this memory. So, and in terms of the future generation, in terms of I'm not putting my child on social, like, I don't put her pictures on social media or anything like that, and that's a personal choice for me. Other people do differently, but she's her own person, and I don't have her story to tell. And even when I was writing about my family, I think oftentimes it's like I was writing myself into that story, you know, like how my relation to my parents or my relation to that history, and writing about her now feels, I think, you know, these little tryst poems are about me. It's like it's not about her, and her story is not mine to tell necessarily, but it's not. But so I guess the legacy would be just, yeah, a little bit of that, like, breaking out of the shame and sort of preserving something about our shared history that I might want her to, that she may need to know for her own sense of self, I guess, you know.
Any other questions in the audience?
Thank you all so much. The word shame and the word disapproval, I just would want to ask you all, like, you know, if you're writing about things that mothers or others in your life would find shameful to be writing about, or how do you find ways to make that? How do you find ways to write that in a loving way? Like, I keep thinking, like, oh, as long as I am doing this out of love, I'm doing this to shed the shame, then it's okay that I'm doing it, and I believe that. But technically, how do you think that's done? Because it's like sometimes just putting those things out there, other people might still think it's shameful. Like, I'm just wondering if you want to speak, if anyone wants to speak more to how that's done in writing.
Yeah, but I also thought, you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, I'll just repeat the question. So the question was if you're writing about mothers or if you're writing about topics that mothers or others in your family find shameful, how do you go about that in a loving way?
Yeah, it's interesting that your question about like how we go about it in a loving way, because, and I feel like everybody in this audience can speak to that, is that I don't know if it always has to be in a loving way, because there are so many things that happen in my family that I know there's love there, but it's not happening in a loving way. And nor is my writing about it happening in a loving way. You know, in the piece that I had, that took me actually, it took a lot out of me to write about the fact that I was pregnant and didn't bother sharing it with my family. And when my mom came over and drove her car over to confront me, she said, "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I said, "Well, I didn't tell you earlier because my stepfather was such a racist." She goes, "Oh yeah, that's true." She said, he was. It probably was a good idea, not to not necessarily me, but not to let him know. He would not have approved. So then how do I write about that with a sense of love? I don't know if there was love there, and I think it's okay within the structure of the family household to say maybe at the base of it there is, or we expect there to be love, but I know that in many households that I know there might not have been a show of that kind of affection or love, and I think that those types of stories of those family bonds are equally as valid to talk about, and I think to open up these stories of shame, because my story is definitely one of shame. I was very ashamed and embarrassed, but I was ashamed and embarrassed of my own actions. That's what I was ashamed and embarrassed about. And in order to understand my own shame, I had to go back in history to say, like, where is this rooted? And if it's rooted somewhere in my family, I don't know if I was really writing about it with love, but I think in the end, it resulted in love for a son. It resulted in some sense of deeper understanding between my family and I. But I don't think that the movement of families is often, it depends. It depends on each person's family. Sometimes it's fitful, and sometimes it's not peaceful, and sometimes there's frustration and anger, and hopefully at the end of it, there can be negotiation and understanding, but I don't know if that's always the case.
I think if you are writing from a place of love, which it sounds like you may be, I really believe that no matter what you're writing about, that's there. It's on the page and somebody can feel that. But I also agree that it doesn't have to be there if you're writing about abusers or people to whom you owe nothing. From a technical standpoint, with your question, I think the writer Joanne Beard once taught me in a class that she drew a circle on the board, and she said, "What do you see?" We said, "A circle, a two-dimensional circle." And she said, in order to make this a three-dimensional figure, it needs light and it needs shadow. And that's how it pops. And then she shaded the whole piece. And I think about that shape and that circle every time I'm writing a character. It needs the light and it needs the shadow. And I always sort of try to check myself on the examples I'm giving within a scene, descriptors. For the worst abusers in my book, someone who sexually assaulted me, I still thought about, the one thing I kept in mind was he loved plants. That's the one thing I could think of that made him a human in my mind. And so there's one sentence about him liking plants. Because even if he is a villain to me, I don't want him to read as a flat villain. He still has to be a person with a pulse on the page in order for the page to come to life in any sort of way, instead of it just reading as a revenge piece, for example. So I think always checking your intentions, always checking if what you're asking of other people is a false ask. Say you're asking for permission. Can I write about you? Can I write about this? Are you asking for that person, or are you asking for yourself? If that person says no, are you going to honor that request? And if not, why ask them? Because that's for you. And just fully rendering everybody as completely as you can, even if it's one sentence about something they love or something they desire or want.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. I like those. I like the questions that you asked. I guess I think maybe our loved ones might feel fear of exposure, or what are we gonna display to the world? And when my approach in writing is that the writing actually always takes over. I don't ever I don't write memoir. I wrote personal narratives, but I'm writing oftentimes poetry, and family and other people appear, but the writing for me often takes over, so it's not as explicit. It doesn't I'm not trying to tell a factual account of something happening, so it sort of I let it go in whatever way it goes. But even if I did, I guess, how many of us, in any certain experience, there's so many renderings, there's so many experiences of that moment. So I guess for me, sorry, I'm being really convoluted, but basically when I wrote about my family in the past, about those experiences of growing up, they were my experiences, but they also weren't necessarily true, if that makes sense. I couldn't rewrite what happened in the past, so there was some imagination to it. So sometimes I would get upset if somebody would ask, well, what are you going to say about me? But it's I'm not really talking about you. I'm talking around you, or I'm talking, I don't know if that makes any sense, but you probably got better answers from them, so I'll just leave it there.
All right, any more? Maybe we'll take one or two more questions. Any more? Is there a question that you guys would like to ask each other based on the readings that you heard?
Well, I think there are just a lot of similarities of things that I heard. One of the things that I just wanted to bring up, just based on something that you were mentioning, is that, and also having to do with the last question, is that what I notice is that with family and writing about family, it is true that, for example, why did my mother get upset, or why has she gotten upset just with my entire body of work? Right, when you think about it, across a few books, she was never really fully happy. She was proud of me that I was a writer, but then every time she read the material, she would get really upset and bothered, and we had to really sit down and talk about, why are you upset, why are you bothered? And I think what I realized in talking to her, and I don't really even know if she really had the words for it, and so we never really fully talked about it, but stepping away from our conversations, I thought that she very consistently wanted to be painted in a very beautiful light. She said, I came to this country, you were born here, I really tried very hard to give you a good life. She tried to paint this narrative that was her narrative. And I said, all of those things are really true. I said, you did come to this country, you did work hard, you did give me a beautiful life. I was and yet my life kind of moves on without you, and I also have my own imagination as well. And a lot of those things in my imagination didn't necessarily meet up with your story. So I think part of she and I growing up together and growing older together is that to realize she has her story and I have mine. Right now, she's obsessed with her own death, so she's planning her funeral right now, and I'm trying to help her plan her funeral. So she really wants me to tell her life story the right way. When you get those pamphlets and when you get the writing at somebody's funeral, she wants to make sure that I write it very well, not from meaning not from my perspective, but she really wants to paint it from her perspective, which is a very interesting exercise for me, to almost kind of be her ghostwriter, because I'm okay, none of these things are true, Mom, but okay, whatever you say. I was let's just stick with the facts. And that's the thing, that there is no really true fact, right? There's just her sense of looking at her life, and there's my sense of looking at her life, and each of us are trying to own up to those stories, and hopefully we can meet halfway. And if we don't, we just have to look at each other, love each other, and accept it for what it is. So I love what you were saying about like these different versions of stories and like how people see themselves, because everybody really wants to see themselves. I think everybody, every human would like to see themselves in a positive light. For example, I really wonder now, like, does a racist really see themselves as a racist? Like, would a racist come out and just say, I'm a full-on racist? I am. And I in the same ways that, I mean, not to compare my mother to the racist, I just think that she wants to be painted in a beautiful golden glow. And I feel like at this point in her life, and she says also, do not ponder the past. I said, Mom, if I don't ponder the past, I wouldn't have a job. She says, don't ponder the past. Let it go. Be happy now. Be happy. She says, every story that you tell is so sad. So, I mean, this is like the difference, too, between different generations. I wouldn't have stories to tell if I didn't tell these different versions of the story. And she'd really literally rather sit next to each other in silence and not relay those stories. And she has every right at this age to do so.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.